now. Welcome everybody, happy Friday. It's 12 o'clock, so that is our time to come together and learn together while we're apart. Today we're going to be talking about peer support and navigating housing. It is a very big topic, so I wanted to make sure that we have at least basic information and knowledge to be able to support people that are either without a home, living on the streets in tents, or on a park bench, or people that are living in vulnerable housing situations, in temporary housing situations, and transitional. So there is a lot of information to share today. If you are a note taker, you're going to want to grab a pen and paper. We will have the recording up on our YouTube channel, though, to make sure that whoever can't join us will have access to the video after we're done. So welcome to everybody. I am Shireen Carrico, and I think we have Lynn with us.
You do. Howdy-ho, everybody. Good to have you all here.
Thank you, Lynn. Welcome. So as I said, we're going to be doing today's session on navigating housing, and I'm hoping that you all participate either in chat or unmute yourself. But I want to start out by finding out, who do we have in this group that is an expert by experience? Meaning, who do we have in this group that has experienced homelessness yourself? You can either put it in a chat or you can unmute yourself or raise your hand would be helpful. Okay, I see Anna. And let me look through. Okay, so Anna, it looks like you're the only person that we have so far. Lynn has experienced homelessness a long time ago. So we have a couple of people that have that lived experience that we may call upon, or please feel free to join in and take a topic and make it personal, share some personal experience with it. I definitely think it brings it to life when people have that shared experience and can talk about it from the first person. How many people do we have on the call that have worked in the housing community or with people who are experiencing homelessness? Again, you can do chat, you can raise, do a thumb up, or you can unmute yourself.
Hi, this is Julie. I have a client right now that lives in a park. She got beat up. She has a brain bleed. They're discharging her to a homeless shelter. And I'm probably going to go see her, but I've been trying to find people to help her, like, for a week. And does anybody know if there's resources in Durham? Is it okay if I ask this question, Shireen?
Yeah, can you put it in the chat so that people can go back and answer it? Because it looks like you're looking for a specific region, so definitely put that in the chat. I also think I see Jimmy did a thumbs up that he's working in the housing and homelessness community. Was there anybody else that I missed? Lori, I see your thumb up. Anna. Okay, so we also have, in addition to several people with lived experience, we also have people that have experienced professionally working and navigating the system. So your experience becomes critical as well. Share the information that you have, your own lessons learned, and certainly make the topics relevant to that as we go along. So that's just an invitation for people to share what they know, particularly on the housing side. That is a critical piece of supporting people to navigate difficult situations. And Julie just mentioned one of so many different examples of difficult experiences that people end up having that we're in the position of trying to figure out how to support them effectively and help them find a home. So before we get started, just my little disclaimer about Peer Voice North Carolina. These Lunch and Learns are products of Peer Voice North Carolina. Our Facebook page link is on the right-hand side. Our Survey Monkey, if you want to stay in touch or get mailings, newsletters, opportunities that come our way, that link is to the right. And our YouTube channel that hosts all of these videos after we're done, that will be on the right as well. PVNC is a federally funded effort to mobilize people that have been directly impacted by mental health and/or mental health and substance use issues in North Carolina, as well as some of the related social justice challenges like homelessness. As a matter of fact, we have a coalition of people that have experienced homelessness that are working together to provide training for permanent supported housing from the vantage point of their lived experience, and that's being done through PVNC. So a couple of things to know about PVNC is we typically work through topic-based coalitions. These are several examples of coalitions that we have going on right now. Our supervisory training for peer support specialists will begin probably the end of August, mid to end of August. Our CEUs for peer support specialists are included in the Lunch and Learn, and we have just taken on a new initiative called I'm In, which is focused on community inclusion across the state. So you will be hearing more about that particular initiative. We also work on standards to elevate peer support in our state. That includes things like service definitions, quality standards, funding streams for independent consumer-run and peer-run organizations, as well as our Technical Assistance Center. And just a few developments to share with you from this week that I have linked. The first one is that we have published recommendations from our Peer Support Specialist Expert Commission around an oversight body certification and decertification for peer support specialists in North Carolina. If you're interested in what the recommendations ended up being, please go to the Google Drive that I have linked here. We also have published a paper on bringing North Carolina into better alignment with best practices around peer support, and a whole bunch of recommendations that we have lent from national and international research and trends around best practices in peer support. So that can be found at that link. And then the third one is our white paper on peer support. It's very good information about data and research, history, and ensuring that we are meeting the integrity of the history of peer support, but also building the workforce to be competent and supervisors to be competent. So that is the third link that we have published this week. If you're interested in any of them, please go ahead, take a look. You're welcome to download them and share them. Okay, so let's go back to our wellness wheel, our 8 dimensions of wellness. If you've been on these Lunch and Learns, you know that we have talked about the 8 dimensions of wellness, and that historically we have believed that health was really focused on mental health in the behavioral health community. And we are learning and recognizing that in order to truly have a quality of life, we have to have a full life. And the 8 dimensions of wellness are examples of different areas of each of our lives that if we build up, all contribute to quality of life. Today, we're going to be talking about the top left, which is environmental. That is about having a home that is comfortable, that is stimulating, that is pleasant, that is safe. We'll talk about home ownership. We'll talk about subsidies. We'll talk about some of the shifts that have occurred on the housing side throughout the years, and we are going to talk about TCLI and a couple of other things. So there's a lot for us to cover just under this one dimension of wellness. An hour and a half is not sufficient to talk about housing and housing navigation. I tried to call out the areas that I felt like foundationally we all need to know in order to not be so dangerous when it comes to supporting people around housing. And so hopefully you will find it to be very usable information. So based on what we know, a lot of literature, a lot of research, anecdotal information, when people start expressing their dreams and their hopes, typically the top 3 land in one of these categories. I want my own place to live. I want a job or a way to make money. I want somebody that loves me that is not paid to be there. So if we were to break those down, that means that I don't want to live in a group home or a residential treatment program. I want to live in my own space. I want a job that is important to me, that is meaningful, that I can earn a living and be able to pay for that place. And I want somebody that is there because they want to be there and they support me and they love me, not because they are paid to be in my life. I want a life that is not just surrounded by professionals. So those are the top three constant. Usually they're followed by the fourth, which is transportation. But these three are very, very consistently shared as the things that people aspire to. So we're going to talk about the apartment, we're going to talk about the home, about the housing piece today. And we will end talking a little bit about employment because we're going to do a 12-week employment series coming up to understand how to support people around employment, supported employment, and around benefits and information about understanding benefits so that we can support others. So if we look at the layout, and this is from 2019, every year there is something called a point in time count, or you'll see it called a PIT. And that is a time where every community comes together in an organized way, and for one day, they try to do a head count of how many people are experiencing homelessness in their community in that one day. It is actually found to be a valid and reliable evaluation of the housing numbers on an aggregate level. And the most recent point in count data comes from 2019, where they found that approximately 30,000 North Carolinians were experiencing homelessness at that time. This is the breakdown. 31% are families with children and 69% are adults without children. Less than 1% were children who were living on the streets unaccompanied. I can tell you, sometimes this information can be a little bit deceptive. We have, just in Charlotte where we live, we have a whole community of young people that are unaccompanied, living together. That are off the grid that people are not aware of. So they may or may not be counted in this head count. So we need to keep in mind that these are estimates, they're not exact numbers. 17% are under 18 years of age. So 17% of people experiencing homelessness in North Carolina for that year are under 18. 14% are considered chronically homeless. We are going to talk about the definition of chronic homelessness, but for the purposes of this percentage, it is somebody with a disability, mental health or substance use, or a veteran with a disability that has been homeless for at least a year. There are a lot of nuances that go into the definition of chronic homelessness, so we will break that down in a little bit. 10% were veterans. 51% African American, which is a disproportionate number considering about 22% of our population in North Carolina are people that identify as Black or African American. So we have a disproportionately high percentage of people of color that are experiencing homelessness. 38% female, 8% are domestic violence survivors, and 6% are 18 to 24 years old. We have actually decreased our count of people experiencing homelessness, but again, I will say that the definition of homelessness has changed, and so we have found a decrease as the definition has gotten stricter. So I'm not completely convinced that that is because we are actually reducing homelessness versus identifying people differently around who counts for homelessness in North Carolina. So it is complicated. Julie, you started to mention medical issues. You're talking about somebody with a mental health diagnosis in a really vulnerable position, and it's very difficult, or can be very difficult, to support people in finding a home. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Part of it is because housing is very systems-based. So if you're coming in under the behavioral health umbrella, there's a whole host of housing options that are often based on your disability, clinical criteria, and your income or your insurance status. The veterans community has a different system. The housing and homelessness community has a whole array with a system in place and a process that if you're not familiar with it, you can walk away not even realizing that it is a disconnected system with its own requirements. Same thing with criminal justice, domestic violence. They all have different funding sources, different options, different procedures, different requirements, and different qualifications. That can make it very difficult and very fragmented as we are supporting somebody to find a home, particularly people that fit in a category but not in another category, or they cross over multiple systems it can be challenging to navigate because oftentimes these systems are not coordinated or work together. It is also geographic based. So housing in Charlotte, North Carolina looks different than it does in Winston-Salem, which looks different than in Cherokee, which looks different than it does in Wilmington. Everywhere we go in North Carolina, there are some consistent subsidies and themes, but is inconsistent in terms of the capacity, what is available, where, and what that process looks like. And so it is critical as peer support specialists and allies to know your local resources and to know your local processes, because it's not necessarily going to convey from one community to the next in North Carolina.
And to know the resources of your neighboring communities, because depending on the requirements, someone may be able to take advantage of something that's in a more urban area if you're close to that, etc. So to know, you know, if you don't have a lot of resources, is there a community near you that does?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, if somebody is interested or willing to relocate, and we see that happen all the time, to know neighboring communities, but also what's happening around North Carolina becomes critical. Because just because somebody is currently in your community doesn't mean they want to stay there, or it doesn't mean if they were presented with an option to move, to relocate, that they wouldn't be willing to do that. And so it is really a critical piece of information as peer support specialists to know. The level of homelessness also differs from community to community, and the options differ based on your level of homelessness. I'll discuss that more in detail later. The urgency varies from community to community, and the income base depends on your financial situation and what is available to you. So all of these circumstances can make it difficult to understand what options are there, how to navigate them, and how to go in and out of these systems and be knowledgeable enough to support other people to navigate their options. So it can be complex. I'm going to share with you some resources that are pretty much across the board throughout North Carolina as places for you to start. I want to start with housing first because I want to give you a context for what we're seeing on the housing and homelessness side of the community. Historically, what has happened is that if you were living on the streets or you were homeless, you had to first go into a shelter and do what they would call be successful in a shelter environment. So think about that. Your first step was going to emergency shelter, a temporary shelter, a shelter for men, a shelter for women, and you had to determine or be determined to be successful in that environment in order to maybe at some point go on to transitional housing. Transitional housing is temporary housing. And so you wouldn't go on to something permanent. You know that you would go on to something that was temporary without a definition of what temporary meant. And you had to be successful or demonstrate that you were successful in transitional housing in order to be deemed capable to go into your own home. And to go into your own home, it was based on your income, based on your compliance level with a variety of different things, including treatment, including substance use, and only then could you possibly go on to permanent housing. Go ahead, Lynn.
I was just going to say that when you were saying successful, what you really mean is compliant.
Completely.
So, right, they would tell you things that they felt you needed to do. And if you didn't do those things, like go to treatment, like take your medication, like reach out to Social Security, whatever they're telling you that you need to do, if you can't do those for whatever reason, you then will not have the opportunity to move up the hierarchy of better housing.
Absolutely. And some of the biggest barriers are things like, or were things like ADLs, making your bed, washing dishes, keeping a neat house. If you were not doing that, you could be prevented from moving on to either transitional housing or permanent housing. Another big one was substance use. If you were not in abstinence-based recovery, the options that were available to you to move on to permanent housing were very, very limited. What we have learned through a bunch of research, I won't go through the data and the research, but what we have learned is that our system was not designed for people to get out of chronic homelessness based on that. There are too many fail points or stopgaps. If you had medical issues, behavioral health needs, mental health challenges, oftentimes that would be a stopgap from you moving on from the shelter to transitional housing. Oftentimes substance use, you wouldn't be able to move on. You had to have certain income levels. You had to be deemed appropriate and able to live on your own. So there are a lot of things that prevented people from actually getting out of chronic homelessness with the way our traditional system was set up. And so people played around with the design, did some research to demonstrate that a housing first approach is actually more effective. And in a nutshell, without going into all the details, housing first says we need to accelerate the connection between homelessness and permanent housing, that it is not a type of thing where you have to prove yourself capable or skilled already, because the way you learn how to be in a home is by being in a home. You can't take a bunch of classes, and certainly how you do in a shelter is not indicative of how you would do in your own home. It's actually doing the opposite. So instead of a readiness approach, a housing first approach says, we are going to first help you find a home. We are going to offer you supports and services that are voluntary. They are not required. If you want to take advantage of those supports and services, they're available to you. And there is typically not a condition for abstinence-based recovery, for medication and treatment compliance. What we have learned is it actually leads to better long-term outcomes, better housing stability, better quality of life, and that people are more likely to engage in supports and services and resources that they find helpful on the back end, if it's optional and they feel like they need it, than requiring it on the front end. And so housing first creates a huge shift in the way housing is viewed in North Carolina. Lori said, do we actually have true models of housing first approaches in local communities? There are a couple. I will tell you that even with housing first in North Carolina, oftentimes they are done through congregate living. So large buildings that house a lot of people with disabilities that utilize a quote unquote housing first approach, because they're not requiring substance use abstinence or medication compliance. But people are still often housed in one building. A true housing first approach is what they call scattered site, which is you meet the person, you have housing options available to them, they go, they tour the housing options available to them, they choose where they want to live, we offer supports, they can agree with it, they don't have to agree with supports, but the housing is not contingent upon those supports. And a true housing first, the person has their own lease. So the lease does not exist between the service provider and the landlord. It exists between the person, the tenant, and the landlord. We are still not there in North Carolina. We have started housing first in different variations, and there are some pockets that are doing really good jobs and are closer to what housing first was intended to be, but we still have a long ways to go in North Carolina. This definitely started reshifting our thoughts around housing and housing readiness in our state. Some of the key components of housing first that in order to truly be housing first, to your point, Lori, includes these components. So it needs to be a decent and safe neighborhood, a decent and safe home that is affordable, where the tenant pays no more than 30% of their income toward rent. Now you're gonna find that there are some housing programs and subsidies that will pay 100%. It is income-based, and if you have zero income, they will pay all of your rent. With others, it's fixed that you have to pay 30% of your income. In Housing First, you can pay no more than 30% of your income. Services have got to be flexible to meet your needs, tailored to you, and completely voluntary. In order for it to be housing first, You cannot be forced or coerced into services, meaning your housing is not contingent upon you accepting services, opening the door, receiving supports, complying with treatment. It is something that is optional and available to you that you can choose or turn down at any point. That you have your own lease in your name with your landlord. So it is not a brokerage system where now the provider holds the lease and you can be terminated from your lease if you are not treatment compliant. Things like that are removed from Housing First because you are the holder of your own lease, which means that you need to know your rights and your responsibilities as a tenant. You have your choice of housing. This is one of the areas where we do not do a great job of in North Carolina. I will share why when we get into coordinated entry, but in order for it truly to be authentic Housing First, people have the ability of looking at different options and making selections based on what their preferences are. There is a separation of housing and services, meaning that the provider is not the property manager. So think about it this way, and we still have many examples of this in North Carolina. I am your service provider, I own the place that you are living at, and I may even be your rep payee. So that is a lot of power in the hands of a service provider if you are dependent upon them for housing, services, and financial access. What Housing First does is separate out the property management piece, so you cannot both provide services and be the landlord in Housing First. Eviction in Housing First is absolutely positively last resort, and every effort is made to prevent eviction. If eviction were to happen, rapid rehousing is the effort to reduce the time that you would have from being without a home, in the streets, and finding a new home. There is a strong effort in transferring from one housing option to another without that lapse of time of living on the streets, partly because of continuity, partly because we know we lose a lot of people when they leave their home and they end up homeless and they're looking for a home again. And so eviction ends up becoming a last resort, and there's a lot of negotiation with landlords and subsidies around eviction to prevent it from happening. And then the last one is access to housing. Access to programs is not contingent upon sobriety in any way, shape, or form. Minimum income requirements, criminal records, completion of treatment, participation in services, or other unnecessary conditions. Again, we are not completely there in North Carolina around this because a lot of housing is contingent upon criminal record and around sobriety. We have sober living examples, as well as minimum income requirements. So this is what the aspiration is. There are programs around the country. If you look up, I think it was Lori who put Sam's name in the chat box. Look up Sam Sempris. He's the one that has created the model, created the research, and you will have access to examples from all over the country that are actually doing Housing First. So permanent supported housing, sometimes you will hear Housing First being referred to as permanent supported housing. So let's break that down just a little bit. Permanent means that you're living there as long as you're able to pay your rent and you're meeting the requirements of your tenancy. So just like you and I, any of us that are in a home that we rent or we own, we don't have to worry about being kicked out or transitioned out or having soft or hard days that we need to now find permanent housing. With permanent supported housing, it is your home and you can stay there as long as you are following the requirements of your tenancy agreement and you are including paying your rent on time. It is supportive, which means that you also have access to supports that you want and you need to retain your house. And it is housing. This is not room sharing. It is not living in congregate environments. It is private and secure home like anybody else in the community, and you have the same rights and responsibilities of any tenant. So this is what we mean when we say PSH, or permanent supported housing. It is deeply affordable, which means that You cannot pay more than 30%. It is voluntary, it's flexible, it's in the community, and that's what makes it permanent and supportive. And it is absolutely a shift from institutional services to recognizing that people can live on their own. And so in North Carolina, we have recently, in 2012, we ended up having a settlement agreement because on the housing side, people with mental health issues are placed in congregate care settings, group homes, adult care homes, institutional settings, because historically we have believed that we couldn't live in a home, in a community on our own. That whole readiness approach has caused so many people to end up in institutional settings. And still, that is the case in North Carolina. If you work with people in the community, you know that you can go to an adult care home that really was designed for people who are older adults and have 18, 19, 20-year-olds living in an adult care home for 20 years, for 30 years, for 40 years. It is not uncommon, and that is part of the reason why North Carolina entered into this settlement, to start building up affordable, supported housing in the community and offering people the opportunity to move out of what they call institutions of mental disease, like adult care homes. Historically, it was based on the belief that if you have a mental health issue, that you need to progress first from a 24-hour-a-day supervised setting like a group home to then a semi-supervised setting like a transitional housing program, and then maybe to independent living. What we have learned is that we have prevented people from living on their own, and the only way you can learn how to live on your own is by doing it. Preparing by living in institutional settings is not the way to generalize the skills and the knowledge and the exposure to living on your own. Actually being able to do it with the option of supports is the way that we support people to get out of institutional care. So that is on top of housing first. Permanent supported housing is a shift in the way services are viewed and delivered in North Carolina. So let me pause and ask Lynn, where are we at on the chat?
So there's a lot of questions about funding, and really if we have funding streams that are actively supporting these, like especially permanent supported housing. Is that really being implemented around North Carolina?
It is. There are different funding streams for permanent supported housing on the service side. There are less funding streams for supportive housing on the housing subsidy side. I'll go through subsidies in a little while, but North Carolina has created some services like community support team. They've added tenancy support to ACT services. So they are recognizing now that tenancy support, the support to choose, get, and keep a home is a critical ingredient to somebody moving out of institutional settings. Unfortunately, on the housing subsidy side, we have a lot of work to do to build up affordability and to build up scattered site housing options for people depending on where they're at in the community. And so it's kind of a mixed bag. There's progress, but not nearly enough. I mean, we started by saying 30,000 people are experiencing homelessness in North Carolina. If we had adequate housing, affordable housing, housing subsidies and supports, we wouldn't have 30,000 people perhaps that are experiencing homelessness. So it really truly is a mixed bag.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And so this emergence of permanent supported housing is a move away from the idea that people with mental health issues could only function, sustain, and maintain. We've talked about that before. The difference between traditional approaches and belief in recovery is that traditional approaches have believed that the only thing we could hope for is to become stable. We do that through treatment. We do that through medications to be able to function basically, and then to be able to maintain that. It was never designed originally around the recognition that we actually could recover. With the emergence of permanent supported housing, it starts to challenge the notion that stabilization, functioning, and maintenance is the best that we can hope for. In a stable, functioning environment, you're living in congregate living. You're living with other people, and you have staff around you 24 hours a day that, by the way, you typically cannot select who they are. And the hope of you ever moving out of that environment becomes minimal because there's so many skills and behaviors that you would have to demonstrate to prove that you're quote unquote ready. Well, that's a stabilization approach. Recovery says, no, we all could live on our own if we wanted with the right supports, the right information, and the right opportunity. And we have to create opportunities so people can aspire to live on their own. Housing now, instead of being viewed as a good thing if we can find it, it is being viewed as one of the critical social determinants of health. That it is a right, that's a better way to say it. That housing is a right that we all have in common, and we have to support people to experience and follow through with their desire for a home. Without it, we are not supporting that social determinants of health, and we are not supporting their recovery. And it also combines the idea of flexible array of services, access to decent housing, safe housing, and affordable housing. Here are the core principles. I think we've already gone through some of them. Choice of housing, no prerequisite for housing placement, decent, safe, and affordable, and separation of housing and services. Housing is integrated into the community. So this is where, Lori, to your question about do we truly have housing first, we have a bunch of standalone buildings that house primarily people with disabilities. When we look at community inclusion and integrative environments, that is not considered the least restrictive environment and is not considered integrated. But oftentimes, that is what people are left with. You're looking at the rights of tenants and tenancy support. You have housing access and privacy, and it's voluntary, as we said before. There are, when we break it down, you'll hear us use the term choose, get, keep. You've heard us use that term when it comes to employment. You choose the type of job that you want. You have support to get the job that you want. You have support to keep the job that you want. And you have support to leave it and find another job. That same approach is true around permanent supported housing. It's divided into 3 different phases. The choose part is called pre-tenancy. So I want you to think about this from the vantage point of your own experience. And for those of you who have lived experience, if you have never lived in your own home before, what are the types of things that you needed? Information, supports, and resources before you felt prepared to decide on where you wanted to live. What did you need prior to moving into your own place, whether it was in your own apartment, even if you moved into a dorm for the first time, if you bought your first house, what are the types of things that you needed to know or supports you needed to have in place? Again, you can unmute or you can put it in the chat. So Julie is saying basic things like an ID, a driver's license, or some sort of picture ID, perhaps credit, employment, or some sort of income or way to pay for the home. Of course, so there are those basic things that you need in order to be able to sign a lease or own a home. Lori's saying how to do basic things like set up utility accounts, processes for paying your lease, your mortgage, process for paying your utilities. If you've never set up utilities, you may not realize how things are metered and how long it takes to set up your water and set up your, if you're gonna have cable or something like that. Lynn is saying at that point, you just wanted 4 walls anywhere. So you weren't even picky. You just wanted a place to stay. Rental history. So rental history can be a huge barrier to people. If you have been evicted in the past or you have no history, it can be difficult for you to get a subsidy and it can be difficult for you to get a lease. Knowing about credit. repairs on the building, budgeting, bank account. So those are all skills, right? That oftentimes some of us don't learn until we become adults and we're put in that situation. Credit repair. How do you prepare your credit to the point where you could get a mortgage or you could get a lease? Mentally and emotionally about losing housing. So being prepared for what the housing process looks like. What happens, what would end up resulting in you potentially losing your home? What would happen in those cases? Furniture, equipment for kitchen. Absolutely. So all of those things, even before we get to those things, on the exposure side, if you have never lived anywhere other than your family's house or a group home, how do you even know where you want to live? The neighborhood. Do I want an apartment? Do I want a standalone house? Do I want a roommate? How do I find a roommate? Does it need to be on a bus line? Do I prefer a quiet area away from major roads, or do I want to be in the city? So all of that exposure around preferences is included in pre-tenancy. This is where peer support comes in. Part of our role in pre-tenancy is exposure. It's exploring with people. It's actually kind of one of the fun parts about thinking about going into your own home, is driving through neighborhoods, looking up different types of rental properties that are available, how much they cost, what a subsidy is, how much can I afford out of pocket, where do I want to live, what types of neighborhoods. These are all things that peer support specialists can be doing on the front end with people. Looking at the eligibility requirements, the application for housing, addressing some of those barriers that you all started talking about, pre-planning for supports. So here's one area where we can make a really big mistake. We focus so much on getting the home that we are not focusing on helping people feel prepared about living in the home. A lot of things can be done prior to moving in to help us start preparing mentally for being a homeowner or being a tenant, especially if we're used to living on the streets or used to living in congregate care. We are doing housing search and choosing different rentals and different units in pre-tenancy support. So the first phase is choosing where I want to live and preparing everything that needs to be done to find and secure the house and everything I need to do to get a lease or a mortgage. The second phase, which is the choose, is the actual move in. There are so many things that need to be done in preparation to move in. So there's the arrangements for the actual move, there's connection to the resources, making sure that I'm prepared to move, that the unit is ready. If you're getting a housing subsidy, typically it needs to be, there needs to be a walkthrough and it needs to be approved. The actual move, adjustment to the home in the neighborhood, and then there's an ongoing identification of needs. Lynn, I think I saw your hand up, so let me pause there.
Never mind, it was back on the considering end of it, so the pre. So just keep going, I'm good. Thank you.
Is there anything in the chat that I need to answer or we need to be aware of?
I just talking a little bit about the TCLI and some of the problems with that. I think we can, and so Lori just wrote, I'm speaking to the choir, I know, which is exactly it. I think we can just say up front, all the funding, all of the systems are young and not well in tune yet. We're trying to get there, but we know that so many of these sound great in theory, but when we get on the ground, we're not there yet.
Imperfect at best. Although I will tell you, so we have been, as Promise Resource Network, we have been working in housing for a very long time, working with people experiencing homelessness for a long time, therefore working in the housing systems for a long time. And we just looked at this last year and the numbers. 100% of the people that we've worked with have gotten a home and maintained their home. And we are doing it by establishing relationships with landlords, finding housing subsidies with people, and supporting them in tenancy support. It is imperfect, we know from doing this every single day, but it is absolutely possible to support people to find a home. The landlord relationships and the properties is critical. Knowing how to interact with landlords and find and maintain relationships. And then I see Doug just put, we need training for landlords and property managers. Absolutely, because part of the issue is just finding a place that will take a subsidy is not enough. What happens that when they want to kick somebody out because they're not keeping their house clean the way that they want, or they're inviting people over, or it's noisy? This is where, oh, that was Fred, I'm sorry. This is part of where the skills go in around landlord relations, around the person learning how to establish a relationship with the landlord, around supporting the person to understand the requirements of their lease, and the skills that go into being in a home. I would say for us, one of the biggest challenges that we have seen that has gotten people evicted in the past has been inviting people in, or people inviting themselves in and squatting in their home. Not knowing how to set those limits, or being afraid to set those limits.
This is where, why peer support is so critical in all of these kind of housing things, because you're always going to be finding new landlords, new places, and establishing new relationships. And people are always, that are seeking housing, are often having to really learn a lot in a short period of time, and often can't learn everything right as they're going in. So having peer workers that are skilled at talking with landlords, establishing those relationships, and helping people who are going into housing to begin to learn the skills to figure out how to set those limits, all of that can be such a critical liaison between the person and the systems they have to deal with. And that's an ideal place for peer support. And then you've got that liaison who can talk with new people that come from different systems or different housing or whatever, as new relationships need to be built. But you don't have to keep retraining every new landlord. I'm not saying that training landlords is bad, but I'm saying that having peer support can really help in trying to negotiate so many different relationships.
Yeah, and Lori said it sounds like our organization should have an intuitive, gifted resource specialist in addition to the capacity to have good relationships with community partners. Absolutely. You know, part of the way to make this work is leveraging community resources. We have a peer support specialist whose role is seeking out community relationships, establishing those connections, understanding the process for referral and navigating, and maintaining the relationships between the organization and community resources, and then making sure that our team members have access to that information and those resources. It is a critical part when we're supporting people that are in financially fragile situations, they're in vulnerable housing situations, or they're homeless, and they're experiencing mental health or substance use issues. You have a whole host of challenges there, and we need to be really knowledgeable and connected and skilled in the area of housing and homelessness. So phase 3 is, so here's another area where the housing side oftentimes has dropped the ball, and that is the ongoing support. So we have literally been in meetings with people that we work with on the housing side that have said, our goal is for people to die in 4 walls. And we have said, our goal is for people to not die. That has literally been the conversation, because oftentimes on the housing side, they are not trained in recovery. They're not trained on mental health. They're not trained in supportive services. They're not trained on 8 dimensions of wellness. They're not necessarily trained on trauma. All of those things that we know on the behavioral health side are critical to quality of life. Oftentimes they're focusing on getting somebody into a home. what they do with their days, how they move forward in their lives, how they're doing emotionally, whether they're feeling isolated or connected or segregated. Those oftentimes are not the consideration within housing programs. This is where supportive services and supports like peer support become critical. One of the biggest reasons why people that are transitioning out of adult care homes move back after they get their own home is feeling isolated, lonely, and segregated. If you're accustomed to living in a congregate situation with people around you all the time, staff around you all the time, and all of a sudden you're by yourself, it can be very, very quiet and very, very isolating. So just because somebody moves in does not mean that we are done. That's actually just the beginning of the work that goes along with being in a home and being successful in the home. What about employment? What about financial sustainability? What about moving on to home ownership? What about relationships? Re-engaging with family if you've lost connection, developing hobbies, connection to other people and relationships. What about engaging in peer programs, support groups? Things like that are the things that we need to, that we're focusing on in ongoing tenancy. So those are the three different areas. For peer support specialists, this is just a highlight of things that we then need to know, given all of this. Knowledge areas around housing, rights and responsibilities of tenant and landlord, so we can share that information with people. Fair housing and what that means in terms of discrimination, predatory lending, affordable housing resources. Where are the subsidies? What are they? What are the requirements for those subsidies? Where are the affordable housing programs? What are the options? What's the eligibility? What is there a network of property managers and landlords? Those are critical pieces of information that you can do self-study. Right now, during COVID, as a peer support specialist, if you do not have a lot in your toolbox around housing, you can do that at this point. Same thing with community resources, to Lori's point. Look at the 8 dimensions of wellness. Do we have access to resources around each of them? And not just one, but multiple. If we do not know that information as peer support specialists, how are we going to connect people with the resources that can be helpful? We literally look at that wheel and say, how many financial resources do we have? How many housing resources do we have in subsidies? How many spiritual connections do we know about? How many social connections are we aware of that are free or inexpensive in our area? What about education? What about employment? Who's hiring? You want to build up your toolbox with as many resources that you're aware of in those 8 dimensions as you can in order to be effective as peer support specialists. And then you need to know about entitlement programs, housing subsidies, rental agreements, and what that process looks like. I will share that information with you on the back end of this. So we will go through that today. In terms of your role, engagement and relationship, no different than a peer role in any other system. If we are not developing mutual, non-hierarchical, authentic relationships, it doesn't matter what we try to accomplish with people. It becomes irrelevant. We are supporting people to explore what their options are, to help them become exposed to those options, to navigate the systems and the subsidies. Supporting informed decision-making is critical as a peer supporter role when it comes to housing. And then you will see a bunch of links in here. This is a link about tenancy rights that is written for tenants. So if you click on here, you're gonna get a whole series, including a checklist for people to start thinking through what their preferences are on the housing side. As a matter of fact, let me stop this and show you what that looks like. So this is one of many tools for tenants. This is a free resource from SAMHSA. You will see the first thing that's in here is a checklist. Let me see if I can make that any bigger. There we go. Is a checklist around where do I prefer to, what am I looking for? Where do I want to live? Do I want to live with myself or other people? Do I want to live with all women? Do I want to live with men? Is a shared bathroom in the hall acceptable? What features am I looking for in a home, including dishwasher, air conditioning, on-site laundry? Do I need accommodations? Do I need a first floor apartment or something that is ADA for my ability to get through it? What type of neighborhood do I want to live in? So this entire resource that I gave you helps to create a checklist because likely the person that's never lived in their own home has never thought about these things before. Security, visitors, pets, activities, things, you know, if I have a pet or I want a pet, I may decide to live on the streets rather than go into an apartment, even if it becomes available, if I'm not allowed to have a pet. I have to be able to be aware of those things and make intentional decisions around that. So I wanted to leave that with you, that link with you is just a resource. And when you go through this resource, you're also going to see tenancy, rights, responsibilities, and different resources around that that's linked in there.
I want to add one that probably is not on that checklist, which is if the person is on SSI, am I going to move into a shared living category that will cut my SSI lower? So just to be aware that people's SSI is not just based on their disability, it's also based on their living situation, and they get more if they live alone, and it's cut down when they start to have shared living. So that's something that's important to know about and to be able to share with people as they're making these decisions.
Right.
Lynn,
Disability. I'm sorry.
this Brad, I was just saying too that I've had the experience where person with SSDI income that they were receiving from a deceased parent, and then as they became an adult, I don't know if they just switch it over to SSDI or whatever, but that they cannot cohabit with, say, boyfriend, you know, because it would affect their income unless the other person is receiving the same type of income from Social Security, which really was quite challenging for this particular person.
Yeah, and I'm not sure what that is, Fred. It sounds like Social Security, disability, adult, child, but whatever it is, to sort of figure out what the person's benefits are and if they might be affected by their housing option is really important, because there are variations on different things with SSI and SSDI. Thanks, Fred.
Yeah.
Yeah, and things like, so here's another nuance, Fred, that we found during COVID. If for people that got a stimulus check or they filed for unemployment during COVID, if they were in subsidized housing, may not have realized that it could affect their subsidy because it was counted as income. Right? And so if we don't have that information, we don't know how to find it. People could inadvertently make decisions not realizing that it's going to affect their housing, their subsidy, or their benefits. Yeah, Fred says that's unbelievable. We were very surprised. So other roles of peer support specialists. So knowing this information, making sure people truly understand the lease and the requirements in their lease, connections, and supporting people to choose, get, keep, and leave a home. Obviously, if we believe somebody can never be in a home on their own, the chances of them believing it and then service providers and family members believing it is reduced. As peer supporters, we believe with the right supports, opportunity, information, anybody can live in a home of their own, right? And we want to support people to pursue that dream, pursue that aspiration. We obviously offer emotional support through all the different dimensions of wellness. Our attitude is that you are in the driver's seat and we are the passenger. And if you would like to learn different skills, if it's important for you to learn how to cook or learn how to run a dishwasher or washer and dryer, and you would like me to support you in learning that, that is something that I'd be happy to support you with. And so the goal, and this is really not as much for peer supporters, because I feel like peer support specialists do a really great job with this, but certainly for supportive services, people don't realize that you have to establish a relationship. If people are avoiding you, they're ducking you, they don't want to see you, something is breaking down in that connection, in that relationship. Either you are not their person, or you are not providing things that they find usable, or there is a disconnect somewhere, or they feel like, okay, I found my home, don't need you anymore. Those things are all legitimate, but the indication that that is the case is when somebody doesn't want to see you. And that may be an indication that the relationship needs to be worked on. We can support people with concrete supports and resources like food if they want it. We have to be very conscientious to not go into the role of a case manager, but that's all in the approach as we've talked about in previous lunch and learns. But these things are absolutely part of what the role could be as peer support specialists. And then, you know, with engagement, I don't feel like I need to go through this with you all as peer support specialists, but there are certain key ingredients to make sure that people feel comfortable and that we are building trust and respect. And part of it is patience and unconditional regard. You know, it may not work out this time, and that's okay. The person may lose their home or choose to leave their home. It's okay. It's not personal. This is their life. And we are there unconditionally throughout this process and not taking it personally when it doesn't work out for the person. Okay, so I want to get into some of the subsidies because it seems like with the chat, that's information that you all want to know. So let me start with some basic things. Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, is a federal department. It was established in 1965, and it is all about affordable housing and home ownership. You can look it up and find information ad nauseum. HUD does a few different things. They manage financial assistance for rental subsidies and vouchers, and typically either contract that out, gift it out through grants, or manage it in local communities. They focus on fair housing to prevent discrimination for housing based on certain indications, sex, race, national origin, religion, and color. And they implement something called continuum of care, which is probably one of the most important pieces that you need to know as peer support specialists. I left a link on the bottom because a lot of this housing stuff is going to be self-guided search. You're going to have to learn this information on your own. And this is a link that you can go on, look at your area, and find homes that accept HUD vouchers or in the HUD network through going to that search box that I have on the bottom. So community of care. Community of care has been established, and it's relatively new in operation throughout North Carolina, but it is actually required now in all communities throughout the country because there was such a disconnection between many systems and many financial systems. So the point of it was to bring systems together, have easier access for people to navigate and coordinate housing, housing subsidies, and have access to housing that they qualify in their community. Their goal is to bring communities together to end homelessness through a seamless, coordinated effort. Their goal is to rehouse individuals quickly that lose a home so they are not sitting on the streets or in shelters for a long time. And their goal is to ultimately optimize self-sufficiency through housing. You're going to hear it called coordinated housing assessment, or coordinated entry. Every community calls it something a little bit different. In our community, it's called coordinated housing. In others, it's called coordinated entry. Let me tell you what it means. It means that in every community, they have to have an assessment system that identifies on the front end every person's needs, housing needs, and level of qualifications that they have. It used to be that we would have to support people to find a whole bunch of subsidies and housing options and what was available. On the housing side, what this coordinated assessment and coordinated entry does is create a single portal of entry for homelessness and housing services and subsidies in your community. Here's the challenge. If you are helping somebody look for housing or housing subsidies and you don't know about this, they're not going to have access. So that's challenge number one. Number two, they have to have an assessment. The assessment is done at certain locations throughout your community. Not anybody can do a coordinated assessment. They have to be trained, and you have to schedule it. Number three challenge, if people are not prepared for what is on that housing assessment, they may not answer correctly. So let me give you a concrete example. Oftentimes, the people that are experiencing homelessness or mental health or substance use issues are taught to deny that they have a substance use issue, because they would then be denied housing if they're actively using substances. In this coordinated assessment, it is actually opposite. If you have a substance use issue, you have actually a higher priority. If you have medical issues, you're on a higher priority. If you have physical health issues, you're a higher priority. If you're a veteran, if you have mental health diagnosis, all of these things are critical to be honest with around this housing assessment, because this is what you will end up with determining how urgent you need housing. So let me pause there, because this is so important that I want to make sure that I was not clear as mud with this.
You know, excuse me, I think what's important in what you're saying, Shireen, is whenever we're advocating for folks in any system, it's so important to find out sort of what they're looking for, and so that we can guide people of, you know, which housing system do you say you have substance use in versus which one do you not? You know, all of those kind of things are the pieces that really promote good, strong advocacy for folks.
It is, and knowledge is power. We know what's on the assessment, and we go over it with people in advance, so they are prepared to go in and answer questions. You know, they ask questions like, how many times you've been homeless, for how long, where were you staying? If you've been on the streets for 10 years, 5 years, 3 years, 20 years, like many people we have come in contact with, to remember where I was staying at the time I was living on the streets, when and for how long, is not an easy thing to recollect. And so as a peer support specialist, knowing where these assessment locations are, getting a copy of the assessment ahead of time, learning what the assessment is used for and how it's scored, so we can support people in advance of them going and completing this assessment with somebody they've never met, is a critical part to success. Because what happens after this assessment in most communities is that people get a score. And that score is what determines how eligible you are for what type of housing and how urgent it is. Okay? So that is the housing assessment. That coordinated assessment is what's used to determine everything from rapid rehousing to emergency shelter, any resources and supports that you are eligible for, transitional housing that you're eligible for, and permanent supported housing. It's used to determine the level of subsidy that you qualify for. So Lori's asking if I can share a link to an assessment format that you can look at. Yes, there is one that has been the most frequently utilized, called the VI-SPDAT. V-I-S-P, I think it's D-A-T. Juan, if you know the answer or somebody else knows the answer for the acronym, please put it in there. But if you look that up, you are going to see the types of questions that they ask on any typical coordinated entry assessment. They're consistent types of questions. You can call up your coordinated assessment locations and ask them for a copy of the tool. You can even go to training on how to utilize that tool. You can request, if the person wants you to go to the assessment with them, as a peer support specialist, you can go to the assessment with them. We do all of that as peer support specialists at PRN with our housing programs. So here's another nuance that you need to know. They have changed the definition of chronic homelessness. From a logical perspective, you might think that if somebody is living on the streets, they're automatically qualifies as being homeless. That is not true. As a matter of fact, I've linked the full definition below. You can go in and see how it's defined. I have just called out the things that you need to be aware of right off the top. Number one, in order to be chronically homeless, you have to be homeless with a disability and either live in a place that's uninhabitable, that is not considered a safe haven, and there's a definition for safe haven, and it is not an emergency shelter. So let me say that again. If you are living in a shelter or you are staying in a hotel, you are not considered chronically homeless. If you have been in jail or prison, you are considered to have been housed, unless under certain circumstances. So number three becomes critical. You have to either have been chronically homeless for 12 months in a row, or have had 4 different occasions within the last, I think it's 2 years, in which those 4 occasions equals 12 months. And between the occasions, you have to have been on the streets for at least 7 consecutive nights. So if you stay with a family member one night, or you go to a hotel for a couple of nights, that is not considered 7 consecutive nights of homelessness. I'm blowing your mind right now. I hope your mind is blown, because this is part of the reason why people don't qualify for housing programs and subsidies. And number 4, a person who meets all of these and has been in a jail or an institution or treatment facility for less than 90 days, and they've met all of these requirements before entering the facility, also counts as chronically homeless. Yes, couch surfing is definitely prohibitive in this case. If the person goes to an assessment and they're asked if they're homeless and the person says yes, but I've been staying in a car, or I've been staying, not a car, because a car would be considered uninhabitable, depending. They say, I've been staying on a friend's couch, that will affect the definition of homelessness and where they score in their housing assessment. So it's really important for us to know the definition of chronic homelessness, to understand how these things are scored. The other thing to know, and this becomes a very difficult thing, is people have to give proof of homelessness. You can't just say you've been out in a tent for 12 months. They're going to ask for some sort of evidence, a letter from a shelter, going to a food pantry or a soup kitchen, something that can substantiate that you were in fact homeless. Again, these conditions make it difficult, can make it difficult. So let's talk about some of the grants from HUD and then some of the subsidies. I have linked every single one of these because for every one, they have their own qualifications, requirement, referral process, and who monitors or manages the funding in your local community is what you need to know. So ESG stands for Emergency Solutions Grant, and what's covered under ESG is outreach, emergency shelter, homelessness prevention, and rapid rehousing. If you go to HUD Exchange under ESG, it explains the program, who qualifies, and you can look up who your ESG administrative agency is in your local community. HOPWA is housing for people that have been diagnosed with AIDS, and there is specific subsidies for HOPWA. Same thing with Rural Housing Stability Assistance, or RHSP. This is rehousing, but it also has money to pay for things that can keep people in a housing situation, or families that may be in danger of losing their housing in an imminent way. They might be able to come in with emergency rental subsidies. And it also is about the lowest income residents of the community to afford stable housing. The next one is called HUD-VASH, and this is specific to veterans. And the link for HUD-VASH is below. And a few subsidies I want to share with you. The first one is Section 8 subsidy. I think a lot of people know about it. It's also called Housing Choice Voucher. With Section 8, different physical environments will qualify for Section 8 subsidy. Oftentimes, there is a waiting list for Section 8, and there are requirements for landlords to accept a voucher with Section 8. But if you're not familiar, Section 8 is a HUD rental assistant voucher. There's also something called Section 202, which is housing for older adults, 62 years of age and older. And there are project-based assistance that are specifically tied into housing. Sometimes it's called public housing. So those are like big buildings that will house people with disabilities and older adults. That is rental assistance, but it's project-based, it's site-based. So the subsidy doesn't follow the person, the subsidy follows the unit. Shelter plus care is one of the things, Lori calls it shelter minus care, which made Lynn laugh and makes me laugh. Shelter plus care is also a subsidy. That happens to be the program that PRNs, peer support specialists, tenancy support and supported employment works with shelter plus care. For people that have the subsidy that do not have Medicaid, we do all the plus care. We do the landlord relationships. We do tenancy support, peer support, and supported employment. This is a rental subsidy that will pay up to 100% of your rent. It is income-based. It is specifically for people that are both experiencing chronic homelessness, that have disabilities, that have the most challenging barriers to accessing a home. They are individual homes. So it's not a big building with apartments or individual people sharing rooms. These are your own home. You can either have a 1-bedroom or a 2-bedroom depending on your situation. And there are 4 different examples of shelter plus care subsidies below. Tenant-based is for people that have been deemed chronically homeless, that can choose a location and the assistance moves when they move. Usually the term is about 5 years, in which the point the county has to re-up to be able to manage that subsidy. Sponsor-based rental assistance, project-based rental assistance, and Section 8 single room occupancy. So you can read all of those yourself, but I just wanted to share with you that shelter plus care may be an option for folks. The next subsidy is Key Rental Assistance Program. This is a North Carolina specific subsidy. It was piloted with North Carolina DHHS with the Housing Finance Agency. It's called Key Rental. And what Key does is provide rental assistance, security deposits. They will reimburse landlords for damages, vacancies, unpaid rent, because this subsidy stays with the location, not with the person. So if a person moves out of a Key rental property, they don't keep their subsidy, it stays with the property. It's for people with a gross income below 50% of the AMI, earning less than $300 a month coming into the household, and they can have SSI, SSDI, and VA benefits. And the link to North Carolina Housing Financial Agency and Key is below. There are also low income and affordable housing. I'm going to say affordable in air quotes. These 3 search engines are places that you can go and look at where the affordable housing is, the units are in your area. So the first one is North Carolina Housing Search, the next one is Social Serve, and the last one is rentalassistance.us. If you go to any of these links, you put in your geographic area, there will be maps of low income and affordable housing that will come up, including HUD Section 8, places that will accept those types of housing vouchers will come up.
Maureen, there's
Yes.
some questions from Lori on Shelter Plus Care. Can people be in apartments with Shelter Plus Care?
Yes.
Got it?
So duplexes, and Denise is answering in the chat box from PRN. And so yes, you can be in your own apartment. You just can't have shared apartment with roommates. So the downside of Shelter Plus Care is you are in your own home without roommates. We have been able to do some coordination on that, but for the most part, you cannot have a roommate setting. And we do not coordinate it through the MCO. We coordinate it through our county. It is a county managed, Shelter Plus Care is a county managed subsidy. It cannot be congregate setting, meaning group homes, or an apartment building completely set aside for people with disabilities. But you can have your own apartment in an apartment complex as long as it's in an integrated, it's in a community. Yeah, scattered sites. Yep, that's exactly right. Yes, county managed. Our contract for our Shelter Plus Care peer support programs is with our county. It's not with our MCO. That's why we do all the plus care for people without Medicaid. Any other questions in the chat from that?
I just want to say, as an advocate, in different roles, you're never going to know all this. So
Right.
don't feel like you should be expected to know all this, because it's going to change next week anyway. You know, what's there this week is not going to be there next week, and then there's going to be changes. What's important to know are where are the resources for you to get the most updated information that can match people you're supporting in that moment. So the relationship with those people who focus, like in this area, or somebody who focuses on benefits, or who focuses on whatever other area that we run into, make relationships with those folks so that when you need the most updated, accurate information, they're gonna have it, because it's just
Absolutely. And know the systems. So the housing and homelessness system is so different from the behavioral health system, and we are accustomed to working in behavioral health. But the folks that we support may be experiencing homelessness. If we are only looking for options among group homes and transitional housing that Medicaid can be used to pay for, there's a whole host of housing options that we're not aware that could be available to people, right? And same thing with criminal justice services. There's a whole nother grouping of options available. Domestic violence, there's another grouping of options available on housing. And so for us, to your point, Lynn, it's important for us to know the key people, have relationships, know the systems, and learn what these things are and who to go to. When we have a relationship with all the assessment sites here in Mecklenburg, because there have been numerous times where somebody's assessment was wrong, and that put them from the next person on the list to receive housing to 3 years away. And it was because the information was inputted wrong, it was interpreted wrong, something was wrong with the application. We have had to go back and redo numerous applications with people, which was the difference between accessing a home and staying on the streets. So it's important to know who your key people are in your community. On the behavioral health side, the TCLI, it seems like you all know about TCLI because you were talking about it. It does include the rental assistance up to 100%, the finances to help set somebody up with an apartment. There are supportive services that people can access, including ACT services, peer support, supported employment, community support team, and it's specifically for people that are the most at risk of homelessness due to mental health issues, what would be labeled severe and persistent mental health issues that are either currently residing in an adult care home, an institute for mental disease that want to move out, or who are at significant risk of homelessness or ending up in an adult care home due to mental health and homelessness. And then we have the behavioral health options that many of us know: group homes, supportive housing, transitional housing. Oftentimes they are Medicaid service based, and so the person has to have Medicaid or some variation of state funding and a disability. Usually that disability is severe and persistent mental illness or serious mental illness. So here's what I did not mention on this. And I see, Fred, your question is very timely. When we look at housing options, here are the two things that are frequently not discussed, that are not even considered in these process. One is homeownership. We work with many people, and many of our own team members could not access subsidies because of their criminal history, because of their financial situation, or some history with rental. And home ownership was their only option of being in their own place. Yet when we look at subsidies, they talk about rental assistance and they talk about subsidized housing, but oftentimes they end there. They're not supporting people around home ownership options, the resources that are available for home ownership, thinking about moving out, getting off of a subsidy, working off of disability so that you can ultimately get into your own place. These are the conversations that are not happening around home ownership. And there are resources available specifically just for home ownership. So I want to pause there and see if there's anybody on the line. I know at least a couple of people that have moved on to home ownership from congregate living or homelessness that can share some of your own tips or lessons learned of how you've been able to do that and what has been helpful.
This from, are you asking for people who have been homeless and gone into home ownership?
Yeah, so you've either experienced homelessness or you've lived in supportive housing before. You've come from jail, you've come from prison, and you had to find a way to get a home, and home ownership was your best option. Do you have tips or resources or things that you're aware of that are helpful to people? Oh, and Lynn just told me it's 1:29. Thanks, Lynn. Oops.
Yes, dear, it's such good stuff.
And I see that Anna's not on here, so she can't answer. Anna is a prime example of somebody who had to go to home ownership. We have several of our team members that had to do that. I will ask Anna if there are resources that she can offer that we can put it possibly in the Dropbox along with the PowerPoint. The last thing I'll say about it is don't forget about employment. We spend so much time asking people to get on disability benefits. We have SOAR counselors. We have all of these efforts to get people on disability. And quite honestly, part of the reason why is on the housing side, that's what pays for housing services. Disability benefits is part of the money they tap into to pay for their housing support services. So it is in their best interest that people get on disability benefits. But if you've been a part of this, you know what I'm going to say. Disability benefits, less than 1% of people ever get off of disability benefits. Part of it is because we do not talk about employment and working while on disability benefits, working it to your advantage to someday get off. You know, it's that Hotel California. That is a part of what we're going to be doing in our 12-week employment series with Lynn, is learning about benefits and how to work and the nuances of understanding benefits, so that we can have those conversations with people that are on disability benefits but still want to work, but they're afraid of going off or jeopardizing. Okay, and the last thing I'll share with you is we have 2 films coming up. I will share with you the links when we get them. Recovery month is in September, Mental Health and Substance Use Recovery Month, and we are going to be showing the film Medicating Normal, which is really the connection between trauma, PTSD, military trauma, childhood trauma, the intersection of sexual orientation, suicide, and the overuse of psychotropic medications. And we are also going to be showing The S Word, which is a documentary about suicide, attempt survivors sharing their experience, as well as some people that have been lost family members or loved ones to suicide. The tickets are going to be like $10 a piece, but we are going to make sure that if somebody cannot afford a ticket, that we have you covered, so that these 2 films can be available to anybody. They are going to result in panel discussions from the filmmakers as well as people that were highlighted in the films. So those are going to be in September. The dates will be determined, and we will put the links out there. All right, everybody. That's all we have. It's Friday. Enjoy your weekends.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good weekend. Stay safe.
Shireen,
guys.
Shireen, do you have a second? Shireen,
I have a meeting at, let me see if it's 11:30 or 2. Hold on, let me get off of the recording. Okay, let me see if it's 2 o'clock, we're good. If it's 1:30, then you're not good. Hold, please. It is 1:30, of course, but we can connect after that meeting.
yeah, okay, perfect.
You want to do that? You want to do a messenger?
Yeah,
Okay, sounds good. I think maybe it will last about an hour.
okay. Okay,
Awesome.
I'll message you at 2:30.
Sounds good.
Okay, and I'll wait if you're not there.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
All right, thank you. It was good.
You're welcome. I know this was a lot of information to absorb. I hate that I had to share so much content in a web, but it is what it is.
Bye.
Bye.